Tom and Kristy are back in the Speaking Up is Awesome edition.
Welcome to the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Grant-Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox. This week, we're covering whether China has outlawed due diligence, the new ISO internal investigation standard, Tom's brand new children's book, yay, and Florida man whose hand was caught in the fentanyl cookie jar. But first, Tom, how have you been? How's your week been? And what has been the most interesting development?
That's a good question. The most interesting development, I think it is something actually you touched on, which has been the response or reception to my second children's book. And I had, as I mentioned, my second one, first one came out in December. I was completely unprepared for the response then. And frankly, I'm apparently still as unprepared for the response now. These are really resonating with the compliance community. And I'll talk a little bit more about the book, but obviously very, very pleased and surprised, but I guess as surprised as pleased.
Love that. All right, where do we start today? Maybe ISO?
ISO, yes. So this story comes to us from the FCPA Blog, and Carlos Ayers, a good friend from Sao Paulo, as well as his colleague Joyce Serra, wrote an article for the FCPA Blog about the ISO standard for internal investigations. And whereas I think, Kristy, many people in your shoes feel like, well, I wouldn't say feel like, I would say you know how to do an internal investigation inside and out. Anytime you can put some standards or rigor around it, I think it's a good thing. And I will go back, if you recall, once upon a time we debated ISO 37001 way back when. So I was pleased to see this, not for people like you or more senior compliance professionals who may have to engage in investigations, but to get some standards that compliance professionals can utilize, particularly in-house, to set investigation protocols, because they're not always going to call a Kristy Grant-Hart. It may be a incident that is smaller, lesser, less important, less tending towards a criminal law violation that the investigative team, whether HR, whether compliance, whether legal, can handle in-house. And the important thing there is that you have consistency in your investigation protocol. I think it was in 07, 08, 09 at an event, I heard a presentation on writing an investigation protocol. And it struck me how important that is if you're in an international organization and you have multiple people across the organization doing so. So for that reason, I think it's good. And I think it can help bring a little standardization, rigor. And those tie into two of my favorite topics, which are institutional justice and institutional fairness. Institutional justice, one of the components to me, means that not only do you treat everyone the same, but you do investigations the same. And that's true if it's Brazil on expense account fraud. It's true if it's your top salesman in the United States with some other issue. It's true in Spain if you get a Spanish kiss. So whatever it may be, I think it's important to have a standard and some rigor around your protocol. So for that reason, I applaud not only this new initiative by ISO, but also Carlos' article bringing it to us.
Yeah, I mean, ISO, we still do ISO work in the ISO 37001 anti-bribery certifying standard. So there's two different kinds of standards that ISO puts out, one of which is a certification standard, one of which is not. So this is not a certification standard. I think it's incredibly useful that the number of companies that we go to where even if their compliance team has been trained on investigations management and protocol, so often the HR team has not, and they don't have that rigor, and they don't have the training. And I think that ISO standards, which really do look at best practices globally, have the opportunity to train people in a really beneficial and powerful way. So congratulations, ISO. We love that. We're going to move to, go ahead, please, Tom.
No. Well, I was going to say next up, we have yet another article from the FCPA blog, somewhat related to investigations, but maybe takes things in a different way. So Kristy, what else did you have for us from the FCPA blog?
I have a nightmare from the FCPA blog, and it's not because the FCPA blog did anything wrong. It's that this article is absolutely terrifying to me. It is titled, "Has China Outlawed Due Diligence?" And there are good reasons for asking that question. So the article details the resolution of the very frightening story that Tom, you and I covered in March, when the Chinese authorities raided the Beijing offices of a company called the Mintz Group. And Mintz is a company that performs due diligence and is headquartered in New York. So the Chinese government fined Mintz 1.5 million for conducting what it concluded were, and I'm quoting here, "foreign related statistical investigations," unquote, without approval from the government, which was a violation of Chinese law. So the article said that Mintz failed to obtain approvals for 37 projects that were conducted between 2019 and 2022. Importantly, no details were given from the government regarding the nature of the investigations that broke the law in China. And let's not forget that this all came after the raid in March. The police made an unannounced stop at Bain & Company's offices in Shanghai, and they questioned employees, confiscated phones and computers. And the FCPA blog article recounts the terrifying experience of a British investigator named Peter Humphrey and his wife, who were jailed for 2 years and 2.5 years, respectively, because they operated a due diligence firm in China called China Wise, a big company, including they had clients like GlaxoSmithKline. So they re-interviewed and re-talked to Humphrey, and he wrote that due diligence firms face 10 times more risk in China now than they did when he was operating his company from 1998 to 2013. He also noted that China has enacted blocking statutes that criminalize the disclosure of information about business activities to foreign regulators or enforcement agencies. And the article ends ominously with a quote from Humphrey stating that Mintz was, quote, "a chilling warning to all foreign businesses operating in China. Gather information at your own peril. You can become a target at any time," unquote. Ooh, this is terrifying. So, Tom, how would you answer the story's title question? Is due diligence illegal or outlawed in China? And what do compliance officers do about that?
You're right. This is a very troubling story, moving really to the level of nightmare. I remember the Peter Humphrey story quite well. It involved GlaxoSmithKline and allegedly trouble they were in China for paying bribes, but actually it was something else. They were being extorted because the head of the Chinese business unit, someone had surreptitiously videoed he and his girlfriend having sex. And so GlaxoSmithKline was being extorted over this sex tape. And they hired Peter and his wife to find out who recorded it. And that's why they were arrested, and Peter spent a couple of harrowing years in prison over that. That was 2013, though. This is 10 years later. And the Mintz Group had employees arrested. The Bain & Company have had their offices rousted. And I fear this is a part of a bigger picture, or bigger effort's not the right word, part of the larger U.S.-China breakdown in business relations. And many people think we're heading to war. Hopefully that's not it, and cooler heads will prevail. But there is truly a disconnect between our governments now, and particularly coming out of the pandemic, where prior administration blamed China for COVID-19, and relations really seem to deteriorate. It is going to make doing business in China extraordinarily difficult. I was one of the people who advocated that you have to assume that everyone in China is a government official. And the problem is, even if you make that assumption, then you don't know who you're doing business with. And if you don't know who you're doing business with, and you do a contract and you pay a joint venture partner or other parties money, it turns out that partner you're paying money to is owned or partly owned by a government official, that's a bribe, or it can be seen as a bribe. So it's going to make it very, very difficult. At this point, there's really no answer about doing deep dive due diligence in China. If there's internet access or other avenues you could take, you're going to have to utilize those. It's going to increase your cost, but you have to know who you're doing business with. You can't just assume everyone's a government official and you follow the government official rules. So it's going to make things difficult. And but companies need to think very long and hard about their future in China. If we move to a more conflict or confrontational status between our two countries, you could easily find your employees arrested on trumped up charges. If your supply chain comes out of China or Taiwan or anywhere in Asia Pacific, it could be negatively impacted. So I think it's going to make things more difficult. You're going to have to look very long and hard if you want to do this business, and then try to determine who you're doing business with.
Yeah, I have one of my clients who I really like, and he's in China this week, and I just don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. And I really hope that this isn't a warning shot. But I think, like everyone had to realize, what are we going to do with this whole Russia problem? I think that a little bit of foresight and secondary planning on China right now would be a smart thing to do.
Absolutely.
Well, let's move to something fabulous, like your new book. Tell us about it.
So yes, I don't have a copy to show you. It's in transit, but it's Speaking Up is Awesome. And what I wanted to do, Kristy, this actually started with a conversation I had with my daughter about 10 years ago when she was a teenager. And occasionally I would tell her what Dad did, and she got where she could remember FCPA. So every time we would go into a little bit deeper nuance, it was a little bit more difficult to get her to remember. But I asked her if she knew what a whistleblower was, and she said no. So I described it, and she goes, "Yeah, Dad, that's what we call a rat." And
she literally said that.
She literally said that. And does that sound like a teenage girl to you? Maybe. Anyway, I thought about that answer then, and I've continued to think about it. And I realized we have to change the conversation with kids. Certainly, you and I work in the corporate world, and we work towards helping people understand the positive benefits of a speak up culture. But I want to get that message to kids around bullying, around things that they see, around maybe process improvement of all things. Because if we can have a culture of speak up, it's going to make the school better, the life better, sort of everything better. If you see something, say something. If you raise your hand and speak up, don't be afraid to do it. So I really wanted to communicate that. Overlaid with that is the story in this book, which is the starship Fox Nebula going to planet Pautastic Friends. And Pautastic Friends is my good friend Michael and Melissa Novelli, who are also in the book. They do dog enrichment training to help make dogs more adoptable. They select rescue dogs and they give them enrichment training so that they can become adoptable and move to a forever home. So they are going to planet Pautastic. And one of the characters, a teenage girl, amazingly enough, sees something that's wrong with the engine and reports it and saves the ship and actually makes the engine more efficient. So I wanted to tell a story about Speak Up. I wanted to honor my friends Michael and Melissa for their great work. All the profits in the book go to them and for their work at Pautastic Friends. I got to tell a story. I'm in the middle of a 3-book deal for children's books. This is book 2, and the next book will be out probably by Christmas. So I was very pleased to get it. It's a lot of fun. Hopefully it'll tell a story. It's books designed for children, or when my first book came out, Karsten Tam said, send it to your CEO so they'll understand what a compliance officer does. So
I love it.
yeah, maybe you want to do that. But It's my second children's book. I'm thrilled it's out, and hopefully people will find it useful, helpful, and or just buy it.
One more time, Tom, where can we get it?
On Amazon.com, author Tom Fox, title Speaking Up is Awesome.
Speaking up is awesome. Well, let's go from something that is awesome to something slightly less awesome, if not very less awesome, from our friends at the Wall Street Journal. Honestly, this one makes me sad. So it's titled 3M Settles U.S. Probe Over Tourist Trips for China Officials. So 3M, which is obviously the giant manufacturing company, has agreed to pay more than $6.5 million to the SEC. And SEC once more knocking it out with these Foreign Corrupt Practice Act charges because of dozens of excursions that its marketing team bought for Chinese government healthcare officials to visit the U.S. and Australia, which was in violation of the company's policies. So the visits were supposed to be outings to conferences, educational events, healthcare facilities, all of the things that are supposed to be happening when you bring out a government official. But in a twist, the employees sent out the official itineraries for approval per the company policies, but then they sent the real itineraries for hand delivery within the company. And the nefarious employees used personal accounts on the messaging service WeChat to set up fake itineraries and then to plan the real excursions and trips for fun. So, Tom, here we go. Ephemeral messaging enforcement from the SEC. We were wondering if it was going to go corporate. That may be the answer. Now, had the compliance team actually come across the real itineraries, they might have been tipped off. Because some of the real itineraries include the fake itineraries, they included the English-only events and conferences for officials who did not speak English nor have a translator. So in total, 3M paid nearly $1 million for at least 24 trips involving tourism and tourist activities. And how did they pull this off? Obviously, they've got internal employees doing the wrong thing, but they colluded with travel agencies. That may sound familiar. We've had a couple of those to inflate their invoices. That included a transfer of more than $250,000 directly to a Chinese travel agency to help pay for these trips. So the government estimates that 3M benefited to the tune of $3.5 million in increased sales. Obviously, that's a $6.5 million fine. That's on the wrong way. You don't want that one. 3M reportedly self-reported and fully cooperated with the investigation. So this one is really hard. I mean, I think 3M's program has been venerated. They have won the world's most ethical company distinction 10 years in a row. But really, this is challenging. The same day that this article came out, the Wall Street Journal had another article about massive settlements for the 3M failures with earplugs and protecting people's hearing. And they also have had some massive water pollution issues. What are your thoughts about this case, Tom?
So I want to start with something you wrote in our show notes, Kristy. And I'm going to quote it. Quote, "This one is hard, Tom," end quote. And I'm going to have to disagree with that because I think this one is easy. Very easy, actually. And number one, you had Chinese business unit employees engaging in conduct they knew was illegal. When your SEC order references, quote, secret travel, end quote, something bad is about to happen. And so they knew this was wrong and they did it anyway. So what kind of culture allows that or facilitates that or fosters that? The rules around business travel have been established a long time. There were 2 opinion releases in 2007, which gave us specific rules that everybody follows, and everyone knows what they are. What intrigued me and I thought was actually a good lesson learned was some of the facts you recited, Kristy, gives us and gives compliance professionals a roadmap to look at things like this after the fact. I realize that's not detention. It's not prevention, it's detection. Nevertheless, there are ways to audit your business unit travel, and you laid them out, just like the SEC laid them out in the order. So I thought it was very valuable for that reason. The messaging question in my mind, we have answered in the affirmative. It's not going to be a standalone FCPA violation, but it will be an indicia of the culture. And even though they were using personal WeChat, I bet it was on their company phone. So I thought it was it's a useful case. It's an important case. It's one that really should never have happened because the rules around this are so clear. I was a little disconcerted to read that they're a 10-time winner of the world's most ethical companies, because it's not exactly ethics and compliance, but it's been announced this week that they're going to pay $3 billion in earplug settlement litigation, which is a separate issue, but that's a huge payment for faulty earplugs that led to the damaged ears of many American soldiers over the past 20 years. So 3M is not looking too good reputationally. However, even with that amount that they have publicly announced in this very much lower FCPA fine, their stock price went up. The reason? Anytime you announce a settlement, you have certainty. So that's a very valuable lesson to always remember. It's not how bad it was, it's the uncertainty. And if you can set your liability, cap it, whatever you want to call it, once you know your liability, you can reserve for it. And that's what investors want to see. They want to see certainty. So their stock price actually went up. As counterintuitive as that may sound to reputational damage, their financial certainty went up too. So not a good week for 3M. This case had some significant lessons that I hope every compliance professional will learn about. I blogged about it. Matt and I podcast about it. Matt blogged about it. We're talking about it. It's obviously worth talking about. So I hope the compliance professionals will at least read the FCPA blog or any of ours and take some of these lessons to heart.
Absolutely. Well, talking about reputational damage, let's talk about kisses in Spain.
Yes. The Spanish kiss, and I probably shouldn't make so light of it, but it is just getting worse and worse. And so what happened was Spain won the Women's World Cup, and the president of Spanish football forcefully kissed the Spanish star, Jenny Hermosa, literally on the lips at the conclusion of the award ceremony. It's not, I mean, you've lived in Europe, even though you may not call the UK Europe, not unusual. The peck on the cheek or some other form of intimate embrace that we don't use in America. Not offensive at all. But when you kiss someone on the lips, that's a whole different thing. It was compounded by, first he said, well, she wanted it. And then it became she approved. And then it became, well, this is just a bunch of women. And he has dug himself deeper and deeper and deeper in holes he doesn't need to. I've seen the picture, so I know he did it. He should have apologized, and he should have taken whatever they laid out to him because he deserved it, but he didn't. And now the team has said they won't play for him. The regional leaders of Spanish league soccer have asked for his resignation. FIFA has suspended him. FIFA has instituted its own investigation. On the flip side of that, his 93-year-old mother has instituted a hunger strike till her son is cleared. So we have to say he has at least one supporter on his side. And it's a terrible look. And what you said to me was we should be celebrating the absolute greatness of the Spanish team. Although probably in your house, as in my house, it was another team that was pulled for. But the Spanish played great and played a masterful game. It was truly the beautiful game. And we should be celebrating that. And here we are mired down over whether a woman who is forcibly kissed wanted it or not. And that's just asinine.
I'm fascinated by the pile on pile on pile on pile. Like, when is this guy going to get the message? I don't know. Apparently he has to be taken to court, and the court has to decide of some sort whether he gets to stay or not. I've got my money on not. Yes, and for any of you who don't know, Tom and I are both married to British citizens, and both living in America with our British citizens. So we were definitely on Team England. Regardless, I think that there is a benefit potentially to this, right? We should be focusing on the women's successes, but the outcry in Spain, it's very much a Me Too moment there, and I think that sometimes it's very helpful to have one of these where you can, coalesce around something and say, this is not acceptable and our culture shouldn't support this. And I think that the moment for a major culture shift in Spain is upon us, and I think that could be exciting. So we'll keep watching for when this guy is ousted, because I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen here.
So we are back to ChatGPT. What do you see around, or what did you see this past week or so around making ChatGPT work for your company, Kristy?
Oh, this was, I just couldn't get over this one. So this is from Inc. magazine, and it's titled, "You Can Now Make ChatGPT Work Specifically for Your Company." So those clever folks at OpenAI, who are the creators of ChatGPT, have heeded the calls of people like you and me, Tom. See, they're listening here. We've been banging the drum over concerns about employees putting confidential information into the ChatGPT tool, where the large language model would consume the information and use it in, we're not sure what ways, because we don't know how it actually all works. So in response, OpenAI will now allow businesses to create their own custom version of the GPT 3.5 Turbo, which is the AI model that powers ChatGPT. So your very own GPT 3.5 Turbo will not get you from 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds. However, it will allow you to create your own version of an internal company ChatGPT, which will customize itself, right? It's AI learning based on the set of data specifically chosen to narrow the use cases specifically for your company. So proponents note that testers found the fine-tuning for business feature reduced the prompt size by 90%. So that sped up each API call and cut the costs. It says to start, you'll need to write up as many example conversations as you can think of, which requires converting your data into a conversational model that can teach the AI how to generate correct answers. So, Tom, is this the answer to all of our AI prayers? I mean, this development couldn't possibly allow employees to actually feel safer putting confidential information in the system, or allow fertile ground for hackers, or allow for bias if everyone types in, "Why is our CEO so ugly?" Genuinely, is this the golden ticket that businesses have been waiting for, or is this more problems waiting to happen? What do you think?
Actually, I took a different tack, Kristy, on this one. I thought it was a step, and it was a first step, and that it showed we can move towards addressing some of the concerns that have been expressed by people on this podcast and perhaps even others. So I thought it was a good first step. It's not the be all end all. Much more work has to be done. But if we can start having these types of, and I know we're having these types of conversations far beyond you and I, every business I think is having them, and we're having them in the media, we're having them in colleagues, with colleagues, et cetera. So I thought it was a good first step, or at least a first step, and we'll build on these steps and we'll see where we can take all this.
Yeah, policies, people. We need strong policies. We need training, what you can and can't put in there. It's really different to get an email marketing step versus actually asking it to do all kinds of consideration of sensitive data. Be careful. Just keep being careful with this.
Kristy, next, I found an article from the New York University School of Law. They have a great blog called the Compliance and Enforcement Blog, and it was entitled, "Can You Develop a Culture of Compliance?" And I was fascinated by this article because it really laid out a way to think about these issues structurally with a kind of a protocol that I typically don't see. So it asks kind of three parts: what's your organization's culture? Should you change it? And then how do you monitor all of that going forward? It's got some questions to ask that will get you started. And I think anytime you can have an opportunity to have this as either a template or a testament, it's going to be something that the compliance professional can use. And I think this article is one of them. Once again, we will link to this article in our show notes, and I hope our listeners will check this out. Did you find this to be useful, or perhaps something else?
I thought it was interesting. I liked the questions, the appendices with the questions I thought was interesting. But what struck me about this article was step 2 in the list was to define your ideal culture and accept the trade-offs. And it took me a minute to think about that, accept the trade-offs. We've had a couple of clients that have acquired really nimble, young entrepreneurial style businesses that are flat, not a lot of hierarchy. And some of the companies that have bought them have been more, blue chip standard, lots of procedures, lots of process, lots of what the young company sees as bureaucracy, and the older company sees the younger company as being undisciplined and frightening from a compliance perspective. And we saw at least one of these fall apart because the trade-off from a culture perspective was buying that young and excited energy that has no discipline. That trade-off is going to be profitability when they put in controls, and employees leaving because they didn't like controls, otherwise they wouldn't have worked there. So to me, I think that that's a really valuable thing to consider in if you're going to redefine culture or shift things, what is the trade-off that you're making? Because there will be one. So I like it.
So what's going on in the workplace that got your attention?
I always like a good workplace article. So the Wall Street Journal has a new article that said, that's titled, "You've heard of quiet quitting. Now companies are quiet cutting." Okay. So remember when quiet quitting was all the rage? Well, employees are striking back with what's been deemed or called quiet cutting, which is a bit difficult to say. So what is quiet cutting? It's when you learn that you're fired. You're not fired. Never mind. You don't have a job. And by not having a job, meaning you don't have a role or a title or assigned duties, but you still kind of work here. So the article notes that for some companies, it is a legitimate way to keep talent while they respond to markets and making quick shifts in their business models, their teams. So the unassigned folks are moved into new roles that will be good for the company and their career, but they do have to endure that discomfort time of waiting or advocate for themselves to get into different roles. But for a lot of companies, it really is the slow boat to being let go. And it reminded me when I was in England, there's a prime way to get rid of problem employees you didn't like without getting sued, because they've got a lot more protections over there, was to restructure the department or team. And look at that, they didn't have a role anymore for the difficult person. They're made redundant, and good night. It's definitely reminded me of that tactic. And I know, Tom, previously we've talked about one of my favorite shows, Silicon Valley, which is an HBO show. And when the company didn't know what to do with people anymore, or they couldn't fire them for various reasons, they quite literally sent them to the roof. They would be assigned to the roof, so they'd have to go up there. And some people like drinking Slurpees all day long and hanging out, and others had massive anxiety about the place. So apparently people are now being metaphorically placed on the roof. It's an interesting new development, I think.
So once upon a time in the corporate world, for my sins, I was shipped out of the United States to Dubai. And I had one of those non-job jobs. And I was told, you'll do nothing. And it was clearly a punishment assignment. And they were clearly trying to get me to quit. And they made two grievous errors. One was, it was all expenses paid. And two was, it was unlimited expenses. So
Dubai's expensive too. That's amazing.
It was. And so I got to go to dinner every night. I got to go to the beaches. I hung out. I joined a European cycling group in Dubai and ended up having a ton of fun. Met a lot of new people. And after about 6 months, they decided that if I wasn't going to quit, it was way too expensive to keep me in Dubai. So, and as the senior executive I was friends with said to me, "Well, Tom, you can always say when I lived in Dubai, and they can't take that away." So on the one hand, yes, corporate sometimes do idiotic things. On the other hand, you always knew, at least where I worked, that if there was an announcement they had been moved to special projects, that was it. It was, 30, 60, 90 days. That was it. Special projects was the kiss of death. So, but the flip side of that is, in another life, I was a labor arbitrator. And In the labor arbitration world, you generally start with U.S. postal arbitrations because there's lots and lots of grievances in the post office. And this was around the turn, or maybe 2010, and there was huge discussions in the post office of the need to cut budgets because people were moving, at that point, were moving towards electronic mail, which just when it was starting and was really taking hold. And the post office was losing huge revenues. And they couldn't fire contracted postal workers. So they would literally send them to a warehouse for days where they did nothing because they couldn't redeploy them, and they couldn't fire them. And then a grievance was filed. And so I got to see all of that in action. It was an unmitigated disaster. So you have to do something, but please be creative. If one of my favorite phrases is addition by subtraction. And sometimes you have to get rid of a player, of a team member, of an employee to make your office run better. And you just have to buck up. You have to give them a settlement, because having a dissatisfied employee around will do nothing, unless they're in Dubai, will do nothing to help your workplace. And then, of course, everybody in the law department know, oh, Tom's on holiday in Dubai for the next 6 months. So there. What do we have about?
It's our first 100 days. I think you're going to be talking about the first 100 days of a compliance and ethics officer, what they should be doing.
Yes. So our good friends over at CCI published a good article, Chris Audette, on your first 100 days. I first have to say, Chris, I wrote about this 5 years ago and wrote a whole ebook on it. So hitting the ground running is as important as you can be perceived in the corporate world. Obviously, the standard is FDR in his first 100 days. But you need to be ready to go forward, assess the state of affairs, start implementing, get some low-hanging fruit and some quick wins, operationalize those wins, try to make wins that are, or rather have wins that are little to no cost, monitor what you've done and use the information that comes from monitoring to move to a continuous improvement model. So the first 3 months are an opportunity to establish a solid foundation of your compliance program and you as the CCO. So as much as you can, learn everything you can about the company before you go on board. And after you're hired, but before you take over, try to get as much of the inside information that you can because you're on the inside. Getting going, moving fast, getting some quick wins under your belt, meeting as many people as you can, both or not simply both, but at all levels of the organization. I've seen people go on listening tours. Mm-hmm. I've seen people do around the world trips. Get out there, wave the flag, and wave your flag going forward. What about you, Kristy? Anything from you're in that struck you about this article?
I just was immediately taken back to my first 100 days as a chief compliance officer and reading things like your book and the book that's called Your First 100 Days, not just as a compliance officer, but as an executive. And I think that listening tour piece is super critical. For me, my most important thing, because they'd never had a compliance program before, was creating that vision and getting the stakeholder buy-in for it. So we all knew where we're going, so I can deliver that. That I think is a crucial part that people miss sometimes, that they need that not only engagement, but the same vision of where you're going to go and to know why that's important. So I think the article is full of good advice. I would caution that trying to change things very quickly can be dangerous if you don't have enough information. But I think that quick wins are always a good idea, and that's a really beneficial thing. So if you are starting a new gig, do check it out. It's a good one.
Kristy, has Florida man been acting up?
Yes, of course he has. How much do I love Florida man? Let's finish with Florida man. We had Florida woman last time. Florida man is back at it again. And of course, this comes from the great state of Florida. So this time we are talking about a gentleman called Larry Chapman who was arrested during a routine traffic stop. And why, Tom, was he arrested? Well, when the police searched his car, they found 9.8 grams of fentanyl hidden in a container labeled cookies in the driver's backseat pocket. The DEA has noted that 2 grams of fentanyl can be deadly, so multiply that times 5, not good. In addition to the fentanyl, deputies found 10 grams of cocaine. Chapman was arrested and charged with possession of cocaine and trafficking 4 grams or more of fentanyl. And Tom, as this article came via the internet from Florida, I was asked whether I was willing to accept cookies. And knowing now what I know about Florida cookies, I declined.
As well, you should. Well, Kristy, this has been great. I can't wait to see what we come up with next time. I am Tom Fox.
Thank you very much. I'm Kristy Grant-Hart. Go buy Tom's book, and we'll talk to you next time.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Two Gurus Talk Compliance. I hope you will join us again next week when Kristy and I return for another episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. Two Gurus Talk Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.